Can you hear me now? Okay, good. All right. Glad this thing's working today, at least for now. It is time to begin. It's 10:05. So let's get started with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into Esther. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study your word. Thank you for those that are present here today, and help this time to be encouraging and glorifying to you, Father, and just pray that you continue to be with those who might be suffering at this time. We especially pray for Amanda's family with the loss of her mother. We also pray for the Puckett family from the Durango Church, Father, with the loss of Jerry. Just comfort and strengthen them at this time, and just pray that you might always be glorified through these kind of situations. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Just a quick note. As I said in my prayer, I don't know who knew him, who didn't, but Jerry Puckett from the Durango Church of Christ passed away last week. And so if you just keep the Puckett family in your prayers, that would be great. The funeral was held yesterday. But anyway, let's open up to Esther chapter 7. That's where we're going to be spending our time today. Esther chapter 7 is probably one of the shortest chapters in this book. It consists of only 10 verses. But at this point, we reach another turning point in the book. And the turning point in this chapter that we find is how Haman, the one seeking to destroy the Jews, it's discovered, his plot is discovered, what his intentions really were. And we find out how he's dealt with as a result of that. But I think the main principle that I think comes out in this chapter is how evil is eventually defeated. It's not the end of the story here in chapter 7, but it's a very critical turning point about how Haman is going to be defeated. And that's why I say this principle of evil being defeated, I think, really comes out in this chapter. So with that in mind, we're going to look at two principles or 2 points on that fact about how evil is defeated. And the first principle we'll look at in verses 2 through 6 is that evil is defeated when it is condemned. And then principle number 2 that we'll look at in verses 7 through 10 is that evil is defeated when we deal with the source of that evil. Now, from what the application of these things that we'll see is that evil is something we can defeat, and there are those opportunities to defeat evil that come our way through the providence of God. Now, the stage for this chapter is set there in verse 1, very straightforward statement. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther, the queen. Now, what's the scenario there? What's the scene there in verse 1? Esther set up a banquet, yeah. That's what brings us to this point, is this is one of several banquet scenes that are recorded for us in the book of Esther. But at this banquet, the author is recording this to set the stage for the series of events that will lead to the discovery of Haman's true intentions and will ultimately result in his execution and the evil he set out to do being condemned, properly dealt with. I keep hearing this tapping sound with my mic. I don't know if it's the wire. Can everybody else hear that tapping sound, or is it just me? Let me just adjust my mic here. Sorry. Maybe if I put it in my back pocket. There. Okay, that might be better. Yeah, these banquets were very big deals, and yeah, they could go on for days. And we saw that at the beginning of the book. And a lot of the purpose of these banquets was to show off the wealth of the king. But this is one of those scenes. And we know there are several banquet scenes because in the text we'll sometimes see preparations for another banquet. So that's a good point. Anything else on verse 1? Okay. So this sets up everything we're going to read about in verses 2 through 10. And we'll look at the points, but I think since it's a short chapter, we can go ahead and read through the entirety of the chapter, and then we'll look at the points. So I'll just go ahead and read it today. Beginning in verse 2, and the king said to Esther on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king." The king Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who would presume to do thus?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, "Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Okay, so we have this story, but again, we're looking at principles about how evil is defeated. The first principle, evil is defeated when it was condemned. Now, what's the first thing that happens there in verse 2? Okay, so yes, he asks Esther what she desires. What are some other observations? What else does he say to her there in verse 2? It'll be granted to her, and what else does he say? Up to half of the kingdom shall be hers. So he's being very generous toward her. And he'll give whatever she might request. And yeah, he says even to half of the kingdom is what he's offering to her. And that's a statement that refers to the fact that, as the language suggests, he would give up part of his kingdom for Esther. This is how highly he thinks of her. Any other questions or comments on verse 2? Okay. He might not have been entirely sober, yeah. Because we do know these banquets could have been giant drinking parties, we might say. That's not to say Esther herself was intoxicated, but that was the nature of these banquets. Any other questions or comments on verse 2? If given the text, it probably was, but I can't say for 100% for certain that this was in every circumstance. So it's a good question, though. Yeah. Yeah, he might have been influenced. Just yeah, because yeah, there are the other circumstances. Dad pointed out that if she approached the king without permission, basically she could be put to death, and that's we're going to return to that point in chapter 8 and 9 when we get there. Um, any other questions or comments on verse 2? Okay. So that brings us into verse 3. What's the request she makes? Okay, if the queen has found favor in his sight, but what that's true. What's the request here? The lives of her people be given to her. So that's what she's asking for. But what Esther does not say, at least not yet, is that her people are the Jews. We have to remember that her identity as a Jew has not yet been revealed. So she doesn't bring that up, in other words. That's true. Right. Right. That's true. And we saw that earlier in the book. The queen lived in an entirely separate part of the palace. And as was brought up before, is she couldn't come into the king's presence unless she was called upon by name. Um, so that's a good observation. It is foreign to us because it's an entirely different culture that we're looking at. We call that cultural context, like we've studied before. What's that, Dean? Yeah. I mean, that's not entirely foreign to us because it's still part of our culture in some ways. Um, anything else on verse 3? Okay. I know we're moving pretty quickly through this. Now, verse 4, as we can see, continues the request. What else does she say to the king there in verse 4 about what's going on with her people? Yeah, because the circumstances are still the same. There's still that plot to destroy the Jews. So with that in mind, what does Esther say there in verse 4? What does she tell the king about the situation? We're just looking at the text here. For what purpose? To be destroyed, killed, and eliminated. So she's telling the king about the situation. My people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. So she puts it out there. That's why she's making the request. Now she's implying here that her people are the Jews, but she hasn't yet specifically stated it. But what else does she say? That's it. Right. So she sees a need here. She's basically telling the king, here's what's happening. But if the situation wasn't this drastic, if they were just sold into slavery, she wouldn't have said anything. Now, in the New American Standard, we have this word commensurate. Does anyone else have an alternate reading of verse 4? In the New American Standard, there's that word commensurate there towards the end of the verse. I'm just wondering, what's that? Compensate? Okay. All right. I bring that up because it's kind of a weird word, at least in my mind. Now, so the idea in what she's saying here is that the reason she's making her request is because of what is about to happen to her people. They're about to be murdered, is basically what she's saying, rather than being sold into slavery. But this last statement she makes at the end, she's basically saying, if this was just a situation where they're being sold into slavery, King, I wouldn't bother you with this. And one reason we know this is what Esther has in mind is because of this word commensurate or compensate, and however yours reads. It's a word that has the sense of something being enough to carry out an intended purpose. But as that applies here, what Esther says here paints the picture that if her people were being sold into slavery as opposed to being murdered, she would not bother the king with the issue because the king would have just basically said, well, so what? That slavery is part of the culture. So she wouldn't have bothered the king with it if this was just a slavery situation. But it's not. This is a situation where her people are about to be completely destroyed. That's a lot of information. Any other questions or comments on verse 4? The very end reads, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. Let me just write it on the board, because it's roughly pronounced. Put this down for a minute. And again, forgive my handwriting. Let's see, I gotta. That's the word that I have in the New American, at least in my Bible. That's probably a better rendering. Okay. It does. Yeah. And that's why I don't necessarily like the way the New American Standard renders this verse, because it doesn't really show what's going on here. Because, again, the point she's making is this would cause you more trouble than necessary if this was just a slavery situation. Let's hear it. Okay. The distress would not be sufficient reason for the king. Matt, if you don't know already, he has an even more updated version of the New American Standard, so he and I sometimes go back and forth with how our NASBs read. So it is interesting. So, yeah. She is being very bold. Yeah. Yeah, she, very true. Yeah, she is being very courageous in this. Dean, go ahead. Yeah, we've tried that. It doesn't work. So, um, so I'm sorry about that, Dean. But yeah, she is being very courageous in this, and she was risking her life, and we saw that in the earlier chapters. So that's a very good point. And yes, God is involved in all this. His name doesn't come up, but this is his chosen people that we're dealing with, and God always has a way of taking care of his people, even in circumstances like this. Anything else on verse 4? Okay. So how does the king answer in verse 5? What does he say? Who is he? Whose is it that's setting out to do this? So he asked her a question. So he's asking of Esther, who is it that was set out to do this to Esther's people? Now, again, in the New American Standard here, I have the word presume. Does anyone else have a different word than presume? And everybody has presume? Okay. You have dared? Okay. So, yeah, so that's what he's asking. Who would dare to do this? Who has set out to do this? And that's what that word presume in the New American Standard carries with it the idea, and dared is a good word for that. So, he, so again, he's asking her, who has set out to destroy and murder her people? Questions or comments on that? Okay. Was there a question here? Yeah, there was an edict that had already gone out um, that was setting the stage for this, but Esther has not yet specifically stated that it's the Jews she's talking about, but she's getting ready to bring that to the forefront with what she's going to say in the very next verse. Well, yeah, there's an edict. Let me answer that carefully because we are going to get into this in chapters 8 and 9. They were stupid laws. Yeah. Okay, so she's going to make the request, but the request is going to be carried out, but there's going to be a process involved in fulfilling this request. And that's what's going to come out in chapters 8 and 9, because there still had to be something done that would basically reverse the edict that had gone out. Now, I know I did say earlier that in this culture, laws were very difficult to reverse. So that's why the process had to take place that we're going to read about in chapters 8 and on into 9, more specifically in chapter 8. But at this point, she's just making the request, but it's not going to be immediately carried out. Something we have to remember when we're studying our Bibles is between one chapter of the Bible to the next, there could be a very long period of time. Here we have it in one neat little book, chapter 6, 7, 8, etc. But between chapters 6, 7, and 8, there could be days, months, even years from the events of one chapter to the next. And Esther is just a very condensed book into something that would have taken place over a period of months, maybe even years. But you ask a good question, Mom. That's a very good question. Anything else before we go into verse 6? Okay. I know this is a lot of information, but coming into verse 6, what does Esther say? It's Haman. Wicked Haman is how she identifies him. King asks, well, who's doing this? Haman. She says Haman and points him out as the foe and an enemy who has set out to destroy her people. Now, how does Haman respond? He's terrified. He's been discovered. It's at this point that he's discovered for what he's done, what he's doing. And the text says he's terrified before the king and queen. So Esther is making a condemnation of Haman as being the one who set out to destroy her people. Since that's true, at this point, she's not directly stating it, but she's implying that she herself is a Jew. It's beginning to be revealed that she herself is a Jew. Now, one reason we might be able to assume this is because at this point, King already knows what Haman was wanting to do. We saw that in chapter 3. But here, Esther is pointing out that Haman is setting himself against the king by setting out to destroy Esther's people. So she's painting a different picture. She's painting the picture that Haman has set himself against the king and against Esther by doing what he's setting out to do. And that is why Haman became terrified. He's shaking in his little boots, we might say. He's overcome with a sense of fear. Now, what's the difference between a word like afraid versus terrified? What's the difference? What's that, Dean? Okay, explain. Okay, terrified is being scared beyond belief. Why would Haman be afraid or terrified? Okay, he knew what he was doing was wrong. He was caught, but why else? Okay. And what's the consequence of that? Death. Haman's been caught, and he knows his life could probably end. So all that is something we need to keep in mind. But at this point, Haman is condemned. So this is why I say a principle about evil being defeated is that evil is defeated when it is condemned. At this point in the story, Haman has been condemned and for what he's doing. Now, furthermore, the words of Esther in verse 4 suggest that she could have remained silent. She could have. But because of the evil magnitude of Haman's intentions, she did not remain silent and openly condemned Haman for what he was planning to do, completely destroy Esther's people. Anything else on verses 2 through 6? Okay. So this brings us into verses 7 through 10. Principle number 2, evil is defeated when we deal with its source. Now, what does the king do in verse 7? Or just what happens in verse 7? That's a better question. Okay. And what does he do? Where does he go? And into the palace. Okay. So yeah, he steps away from the situation. What else happens in verse 7? What does Haman do? Right. Okay, so you have the word wrath. Absolutely. Yeah, he is. Maybe. So, that's true. That is true. He does step back. What does Haman do? He pleads for his life. Why? According to this verse. Okay? Well, what does the text say? That's it. He believes the king has already decided his fate. He knows what's coming because of what's just happened. The text says, at least in the American Standard, he saw that harm had been determined against him. So there's already been a consequence. We don't see it in the text, but he knows what's coming. And from the context, it's his life that's going to be taken from him. Right. Right. That's it is called justice. That's true. He's pleading for his life. Go ahead. Yeah. There's nothing new under the sun. History has a way of repeating itself in different ways. So, anything else on verse 7? Okay. So, what happens in verse 8? And what does he see? Yeah. So, he sees Haman at Esther's feet, and we'll talk about this couch briefly here in a minute. But how does the king perceive this? In his mind, what's Haman doing? Okay, what's the question he asked there in verse? So in the king's mind, what is Haman doing with that question in mind? Attacking her. That's what he sees. She's on this couch. Now this couch, if you're wondering, it was some kind of, it wasn't like our couches. It was a seat that was very low to the ground, and it's where people sat. They didn't sit up higher like we do. It was more of a low kind of table that they sat around at banquets like this. So they had to recline in order to enjoy the meal. So that's where Esther is reclining at. And so that's Haman's at that couch at her feet begging for his life. But the king comes in, sees this. He construes it as an assault on Esther. And that makes him even more angry. He's already angry, wrathful. That makes him even more angry. He says, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? It's like someone, you men, this will be like someone coming in and assaulting your wife, knowing full well that you're in the house. Imagine how you'd respond. This person, they know I'm here, and they come in and assault my wife anyway. Imagine how angry you'd be. That's the scene. So what happens as a result after the king asks that question? What does the text say? They covered Haman's face. Whoever of the king's servants is there, they hear him ask this question. They know what's implied. And so they come in and grab Haman. They cover his face with some kind of covering. Because of what's about to happen, they're taking Haman to deal with the situation. Because you did anything against the king, the consequence was death. And yeah. Yeah, that is the image. It's just somebody came in, don't know who, and just basically threw something over his head in order to take him off to do what was about to happen, what we're going to read about here in the next couple of verses. So Haman was still begging for forgiveness, but the king construed it as an assault, and Haman's taken off with his face and head completely covered. So this brings us into verse 9. It says, I'll just read it again. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. Now, what is this eunuch saying to the king? What's he drawing the king's attention to? Okay. So yeah, he's drawing the king's attention to these gallows that were built for Mordecai to be hanged. And that's setting the stage for the execution of Haman. Now, he gives the specific measurements here. It's 50 cubits high. Now, can anyone tell me how much a cubit is? It's about 1.5 feet. So you do the math. These gallows are about 75 feet high. Very tall. But for all of the world to see. This would be a very public execution. But the point of emphasis here is not on the measurements. It's the fact that Haman had built these gallows to hang someone, Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. Right. Could be the best it could be for the gallows. But what this servant, this eunuch, is emphasizing, the king thinks very highly of Mordecai at this point in the book. So for the king to hear this, that would make him even more angry. But so the servant is saying, this is who these gallows were built for, king. King wouldn't like to hear that. So in verse 10, or there at the end of verse 9, what does the king say? Haman. Yeah. Hang Haman. This isn't going to be used for Mordecai. This is going to be used for Haman. And so, verse 10, they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. It's at this point where, go ahead, Sandy. That's possible. He may be coming to certain realizations that him signing off on that was wrong, and that's where the process is going to begin to get this reversed. That's a good question. So, and that's something we need to keep in mind here. That law to help destroy the Jews was still in place. So that's why the process is going to begin. So putting verses 7 through 10 together, the point we should see from these verses about defeating evil is that evil is defeated when we deal with its source. Now, what these verses teach us, among other things, is that evil is going to be dealt with. And if it's going to be dealt with, we have to deal with its source. It's like you have a sickness. When someone is sick, you don't treat the symptoms of the sickness, but you look for the source of the sickness. If evil is going to be defeated, the source of evil is something that must be dealt with. Any other questions or comments on verse 7 through 10 before we wrap things up? Okay. So, the point we should be left with from this chapter that we've looked at is that evil can be defeated. It's defeated when it's condemned. It's defeated when we deal with its source. So we must work to defeat evil. Condemn evil when it exists, deal with it accordingly. And we must always be on guard against evil. Putting on the full armor of God is one way we can do that. But as these things have to do with the providence of God, something we should understand from these things is that the providence of God can bring us opportunities to deal with the evil around us. That's what God is doing in this book. He's using this woman, Esther, to defeat the evil things that were carried out by Haman. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Dad, will you close us today?